Cool. So yeah, I had a call with Stan, and Stan made some pretty good arguments, convinced me that the container registry should be in a separate database. Things that he educated me on was we're expecting a pretty heavy write load. Like if you push a new container, there's a lot of different layers, and that can lead to a whole bunch of queries. Write load is something that is the hardest thing to scale. The other thing was that it's the code base, like it's really a separate code base. It's really all in the Go app, and kind of having that code base not being able for the versioning of the migrations is annoying. You all already told me, but I think it keeps it being a really good argument. Also, it's hard to shard. That came up before. That didn't come up in our last meeting, but I think that's a good one as well. The containers, we're going to have multiple projects probably reuse the same container. We'll have the container once, so it's not something that's natural to shard per customer. Now, not sure how much I'm convinced. In the end, every container has an owner. So not sure I'm super convinced, but it is a good one. And one that was important, like the Rails app will need to talk to the container, but it will kind of use the same API as the Docker clients are already using. And it's hard to kind of rewrite all this in Rails. There's a ton of functionality. A Docker container is not like a package where it's just point people to the tar file to download. It's really a lot more complex. And that's code exists. We have rewriting it would be an immense amount of work. So I still kept this meeting on the schedule because I want to kind of, I thought that the way we discussed the problem wasn't very efficient. And I want to make sure that next time we have a conversation like this, we do a better job of kind of surfacing the things that matter. So I think we already have a handbook section about, hey, we are a single database, and it was, I think I asked for that, and then the MR that came back was, hey, we'll have multiple databases. So that's how how misaligned we were at the beginning of this process. So we came together at, it took a while for us to get on the same page. So now that we are on the same page, and finally I'm educated enough to understand the wisdom of your ways, I want to make sure that we use the opportunity to write that down. So that's my request under item 3. I have a couple of things that we should do. We should comply with a single database or explain. We should have an approval process. Let's make it one fellow and Sid. Does that answer your question, Christopher, since Dimitri is a fellow?
Yeah, that's fair. Okay, all right. Yeah, that was just a kind of, I was trying to think about if I'm good with that.
And then make visible to all fellows. I think that will be my request. You don't need approval from our fellows, but they need to know about it. I think that's cool. Single versus multiple. I have no idea what I'm thinking there.
Clarification on bullet 3, okay with separate schema. Do you mean database or same schema, or separate schema on same database?
Yeah, I think that's where a lot of the confusion came from. I don't think we do separate schemas at GitLab unless the plan is to make it a separate database for GitLab.com.
Okay.
And the separate schema is just a way to make it easier, GitLab easier to install. Instead of needing 5 databases, we just throw all the schemas in there. But in the end, it's always between one schema versus multiple databases. I don't see the case for the separate schema.
Okay.
I think that's where a lot of the confusion came from, because we were talking schemas, but in reality, the master plan from your side was to put it in a different database and use the API. And sometimes I heard that, and it always kind of maybe annoyed me, because like, we're talking separate schema, right? But that wasn't really the goal. The goal was to put it in a separate database.
Yeah, the compromise was separate schema.
It's not a compromise, because it's like, because we're going to put it in a separate database on GitLab.com, you don't have any of the joins or the advantages and stuff like that. So I was asking, hey, can you do a join across multiple schemas? And it was like, yes. I'm like, great, that makes it more likely. But yeah, that doesn't, like, you got to pick one. Like, don't pick both.
I think that from my point of view, the second schema was only because of the requirement to make it easy to install in other places. It was never about being able to join across it or anything like that. It was so that it was easy to set up, which was something.
Exactly. The separate schema is just a way to have the multiple databases install correctly,
together.
But it was kind of a head fake for me. So that needs to be
Right.
super, super clear. Andrew, you get it. Make sure you review the merge request before I see it to make that abundantly clear.
Cool.
I think we need some separate versus joins examples. Like, I had too few examples of like, hey, what is the data that can just live outside of Rails, and what does Rails still need to see? And to this day, I'm not super happy that I have not heard from this group, well, we need to show the tag in Rails, and like, we'll use the API for it, and 6 other cases on like how we're going to use that API. We need to think through that more.
I would say, like, if you've got data that has got business entities like user or project or namespace, and you're not putting it in the main Rails database, that's probably a sign that you're doing something wrong. So, you know, here we're talking about layers and like very sort of abstract entities that we're storing in this other database. And if you take the example of prefect, you know, again, it's very low level data. But if you're talking about like a username or something, that is immediately a sign that we're probably going down the wrong route here.
Yes, you and I are very different, and like where we put the accent. Like, hopefully you see it's comply or explain. Like, the default is put it in the single database, but I would have loved to have more examples to work with, because I felt that now I had to come up with the examples where Rails needed to know stuff. That needed to come from this group. Like, I want you to be to make the trade-off yourself. You can make a trade-off if you don't know what you're trading off. Yeah, the double advantages, like, so we like multiple schemas is only a way to make multiple databases easier to install. There is we won't. I want to see the Microservices failures, microservice failure literature linked from this page, because there's look, GitLab consists of 30 different services. I just made the snowplow Go collector. I understand sometimes you need a separate service, but in general, there's too much of a temptation to go that route, because you kind of, it's easy to see the advantages and it's hard to see the disadvantages. So we got to make sure that's very prominent.
Where is this microservice failure literature?
you're going to find it and add it to the merge request. And there's, we're in good times because over the last 3 months, a ton more came out of all kinds of organizations retreating from their microservices architecture.
Yep. And the merge request you're talking about is the database strategy, right? Updating that to remove the line about schema and adding more of these decision points in there. Is that correct?
Yep.
Okay. Yep, I got it.
Write load is a big consideration since writes are harder to scale than reads. Who can be scaled with playcasts. Yeah, only do schema when it has a completely separate code base, and that's the only like code base touching it. So for example, product analytics isn't a fit because product analytics, yes, the Go collector will add the events, but the Rails app needs to read the events. So like you have two things touching it. Add the example since the Rails. I thought it was kind of beautiful that we'd be 40 examples that Stan could come up with, we'd be using kind of the same API as the Docker clients, which is kind of nice. We need that API anyway. So it is a flag if you need a new API for the Rails. It's hard to short this by namespace is an indication separate DB. So I'm not sure, probably you want to give like, what are indications that it might have to be a separate DB and just phrase everything like that. Mm-hmm. And another indication that the rewrite in Rails of the code is hard, like it is for the Docker containers. Cool. Craig, can I give this to you to make this MR?
Yep.
Cool. Sid, a question for you. Maybe I'm just missing it in this list of the points here. Is there some consideration around the performance impact in infrastructural terms, implementing something in Rails or not, or is that included in one of the items here that I'm not extrapolating out?
So you mean performance for the database or performance for the application servers?
For the application servers. So an example might be, you said the collector, right? And the collector got written in Go probably because Go was technically a better fit for that particular use case. Is that one of the considerations for having a separate code base that we want to document here?
Yeah, probably what we want to document is like, hey,
isn't this more about when we want to separate databases rather than separating services though? And that's kind of a slightly different thing.
It's more about that. So I think it's in the G item when you have a completely separate code base, and that's the only code base touching the data.
Thank you.
I think you have a good point there, though, about database performance considerations too. Like some of the topics that came up from container registry about being write heavy. I think the specific points are called out there, but maybe I can make it a little more generic in the MR, things to look for when considering a separate database. What's the impact on performance?
But our way to scale is sharding, not separating databases. I want to make it abundantly clear, like the way we're going to scale is sharding, not separating databases. Since sharding can give 100x headroom while separating databases can give 5x. And I think that's something I'm really worried about. Again and again, I see people shying away from sharding and moving to separate databases as a way to control this. That's going to give us 3x headroom. We should really focus on the 100x headroom and put all our money there. So I'm really relieved to see Christopher put this point on. Christopher, you want to verbalize it?
Yeah, just I know when we originally set up this meeting, we were talking about the registry issues, registry database issues, but I just wanted to get an update on sharding as well. And this is something I should probably be on top of anyways. So just figured, Craig, it'd be good to verbalize where you think we're at.
Sure. Yeah. And you're going to see the term partitioning here a lot. We'll use the term partitioning and sharding interchangeably because partitioning is the first step to getting us towards sharding using foreign data wrappers. So right now, the initial MVC is to focus on audit events, and we are using the health status to track the related issues within the epic. So this is the epic we're focusing on within the database team. Just this week, the partitioning key was focused. It was a date range partitioning key based on CreatedAt, and Andreas is researching some of the impacts on the user journey there, and then getting some baseline performance so we can know what kind of impact it'll have on performance. And then, yeah, we're still in the early phases of the actual implementation. Andreas, are there any more specific details you want to add here?
Yeah, no, it's a good way to iterate towards sharding because the lots of the problems that we encounter with partitioning, they're very similar to the ones that we expect with sharding. That's why we're doing that in the first place, and that's actually something we can accomplish already for audit log feature.
We feel pretty comfortable that we're going to get through the 13.0 issues all in the next 8 days.
So we just talked about this yesterday, and there was a level of discomfort. I think
Okay.
Probably just this one, since it's not saying on track. We made an effort to use the health status. So if it doesn't say on track, we're probably not on track. So I will update that one now.
Thanks for keeping this up to date. I'm highly interested in the migration strategy. And I'm sure Andrew is as well.
Yep. So
Why are we doing? Go ahead.
Sorry. I think you might be asking the question I was about to answer, but do you want to ask your question?
Why are we doing date range versus a namespace?
That was not the question I was going to answer. So I'll let Andreas take it.
I can take that, yeah. So the important thing with sharding or partitioning is to know your access patterns. How do you access that data? And then pick one that you want to optimize for. And in lots of features, and I think that's what you're alluding for, is namespace is a natural choice for that because everything or a lot of things live inside a namespace, right? In our case, in the case of the audit log, there is the instance level view as well. So we have this admin feature where you can actually look at all the audit logs across the site, and that means we're not always going to have a namespace as a natural key to partition by. And we ended up saying that we are going to enforce a date range filter that's always going to be present. So in all those views, you typically select 30 days of data that you want to look at, and that makes it a good partitioning key to work with, because we can't really be using the namespace key in that case.
So we choose, and it's because you want to offer this feature at the instance level?
Mm-hmm. So this is a good example where things don't naturally align with the namespace key. And I think this is what we're going to see more going forward and applying that pattern to different features. Then we have to find a way how to deal with that because you have to pick something that you optimize for.
So, and this is an iteration or an MVC, right? So that we can get familiar with partitioning, the implementation features of it, and lessons learned, right? This isn't going to be the partitioning design for everything that we do going forward, but this is a good, audit events was a good isolated area of the application that we felt we could comfortably iterate on. So for different areas of the application, there will be different partitioning keys, and that's a concern for future us, right? Because we could end up with a sharding or partitioning proliferation problem, but that's a discussion for a later date and when we have more data.
Yeah, well, I see that coming, and
yeah.
like that's, I thought through that already, and I think in order to, the namespace would help us isolate customers from each other, the data of customers. A namespace would help us maintain the advantages of a single application. And in general, like new features, we want to have them at the group level, never at the instance level. And then you can see the whole instance is like this, a super group or something like that, to make sure that we're working GitLab.com first. But I'm afraid of us choosing a couple of different things, and then we won't be able to join data because we choose different ways of partitioning throughout the application.
Agreed.
So we agree, but we're still going to do something else.
I think, just going back to what I said before, I think this is the best way for us to iterate and use the lessons learned going forward when we approach more of a namespace partitioning strategy.
Hasn't that also a product side as a question? I mean, we have this feature on the instance level, so that doesn't align with the idea that everything is inside a namespace and you only care about that. And I think we have this more often, even like a lot of things are inside a namespace, but some features are clearly not, or some ways of accessing that data are clearly not. And if we had everything inside a namespace, so if users were truly only concerned about what lives inside the namespace, I think we would have a lot easier way of approaching that problem. So I wonder, how do we get there?
Yeah, I think it's an artifact of like the way we started. If in hindsight, you know that GitLab had multi-tenancy is super important, you'd force everyone to make a top-level namespace. Like start with your company name, that's a top namespace, and you'd always have that. But because GitLab started as a single tenant project, we didn't force people to do that. So now we have this legacy. It is what it is. I can't change that. But I just don't want to make it worse. And so I see where you're coming from to solve this particular problem. Totally agree that per date makes a ton of sense. I'm worried about the future where, hey, I want to cross-check audit events with the other stuff going on in my organization or in my namespace, and I can't because it's a different sharding key. So I think I totally agree that it's a maximum, like this is the best solution, but I think for the local problem, not for the global problem.
Mm-hmm.
And
yeah, perhaps we
go ahead, Andreas.
Perhaps we can revisit that with product as well. I think for both the database sharding and the application sharding approach, it's the same problem that we have features that don't align naturally with the multi-tenant idea, right? If we had that, it would be perfect to do on the database or in the application level to implement the sharding. But how do we get there? Like,
yeah, no, that's a good question. One thing we agree with product is that all new features will be introduced at the group level before they will be done at the instance level. But even that is not always happening. But I can see like our audit events, they're not just for auditing. It's our event log. So any feature we have in GitLab, whether it's cycle time or stuff like that, in the end, they're going to go back to these event logs. And you really, like not having that with the same sharding key as you have everything else is going to be a big problem to offer people insights into how they're operating.
I think the event log is still a bit different from the audit log, so we keep that separate. So we're only looking at the audit log at the moment. But you're right. But
at some point, someone's going to figure out that the data they need are only in the audit logs, and they're going to write that in.
Right. Perhaps to give another example, today when you go look at the dashboard for your user, you see the assigned issues or merge requests or whatever, and those are also not by namespace, right? This is a user's perspective, and your user can basically work on many different namespaces and have many different issues assigned. So that's another example where whatever we do on the database side, that's a problem. And also for the application sharding, same problem. How do you do that when your user spans so many different namespaces?
Yep. No, I agree about the problem. If that will be solved by sharding by date, I'm much more susceptible to it, but I'm afraid that's not the case.
And that is, I think, where in the conversation that we had previously, we came in and said, perhaps those are features that would be a good candidate for extracting into a separate service. I think that was the motivation why we started to talk about extracting services, because we see that these things, they don't align with the namespace sharding concept.
Cool. Yeah.
Maybe that should be part of the exercise out of this is, in evaluating this particular logging, is if you could rewrite the world, which you obviously can't, but you know, how would you change it, either for product feature or otherwise? So maybe that should be a requirement of the outcomes here in the next couple of weeks, is kind of thinking in terms of that. Because if it turns out that what we did was we did an iteration, we did via time sync, but then we realized, okay, we really want to get the namespace. Here's what we would actually have to do. That'll help us figure out kind of the best next iteration associated with it, if that's the overall intent. And if that turns out to be a product requirement that product's not prioritizing, then we need to push on that.
Yeah. So, for example, GitHub introduced private instances. Salesforce took a ton of time to make sure that despite them being multi-tenant, people never can access each other's data, and guaranteeing that at database level. So the whole market is going there, where it's super important who the customer is. So I think that much better aligned. So I totally agree. I'm not stopping anything. Like, we should get some experience with sharding, but we should think through this before we roll this out. If there's a sharding thing that can be done by namespace that you're also consider doing that. But I don't want to stop the world. We need more experience. We need to make progress. But let's have at least weekly calls to discuss this and make sure that we're aligned, because this is a product strategy question, and database is a really important part of that. But I'm really afraid of us landing in a local optimization and then not being offering the advantages of a single application, because we have multiple sharding ways of sharding the data. And the way to get there is just tons of examples, like that user example, great example. I assume it's not written down somewhere yet.
We have it on Handbook, actually, on the database group. We put a lot
that's cool.
out there.
Yeah, and to answer your next question there, Sid, what's been done so far, I'll list a bunch of the things that have been done so far. We'll run out of time here. And to your question about meeting weekly, do you want to join the sharding working group, or do you want a separate meeting to talk about specific questions?
No, it is, as long as we can spend a lot of time in the sharding working group talking about the future and the strategy,
okay.
I'm good with that.
Okay, I will ask Sherry to get you invited to that.
Cool. And awesome to see that examples already on the handbook page. Please send me that, and please send me the MR for the database strategy thing we discussed in the beginning of this meeting.
Will do.
Cool. Thanks for educating me. Appreciate it.
Yep.
Cool.
See you soon.